Chronicles of a Psychonaut is about much more than psychedelics and plant medicine. It's really a platform for storytelling. I realized that so many of my friends have such incredible stories and wisdom that they've collected from over the years, and that many of these stories have not been told on the larger public stage. I wanted to create this podcast so that we could hear the wisdom of our community and our friends. Last February, I got to sit down with my friend Denell Nawrocki and hear her story about how she healed herself of HPV and cervical dysplasia without the help of the Western medical industry. In fact, they told her her only options were invasive surgical type procedures, and she decided not to accept that and seek her own path of education and healing, and she successfully healed herself of that condition. Now she runs a company called Cervical Wellness, and she helps educate women about their reproductive system and reproductive health, and helps guide other people through this healing journey. We also talk about plant medicine and ayahuasca. We talked about American history and many things. It was really a very good conversation. So without further ado, welcome Denell Nawrocki. Good to have you on the show, Denell.
Yeah, great to be here, Finch. I'm excited to talk with you.
So you are a fellow Psychonaut, and I've been excited to talk about your journey with plant medicine, with magic mushrooms, or whatever else. But since this is one of the first episodes, I want to kind of introduce the perspective of what is plant medicine compared to maybe how mainstream Western culture thinks about psychedelics as drugs or like even narcotics. And that I know for myself growing up, I wasn't aware of the healing power of mushrooms. I was kind of vaguely aware that it helps you with like new perspectives and can help you find insight and things like that. But I wasn't really clear of really like how they had been used by traditional cultures and things like that. So I guess for you, at what point did you learn about that perspective? Or maybe we can even just talk about the perspective, what that perspective is. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you first learned about say magic mushrooms, beyond just the context of like drug culture.
Well, that's an interesting question because it took several years of me communing with the plant medicines before I actually learned about the sacredness of it. So I'll just give a little bit of history of my use, I guess. I'll start there. So I didn't even know about, say, psychedelic mushrooms until I was about 18 or 19. And before that, I knew about cannabis, but I didn't smoke cannabis in high school. I was actually quite the goody-goody. My parents...
Did the DARE program work on you?
No, it was just more, it wasn't around me. I think my friends did smoke pot, but they didn't smoke it around me. My high school boyfriend actually like forbade me from smoking, which I'm like, what the heck was I thinking? But it wasn't until I got to college, I went to UC Davis and left that high school relationship, did the plant medicines really start to come back into my field. And so started with cannabis. And I remember the first time I got actually high on cannabis. I had a full-on visionary experience where I was like in a different world. I was experiencing things that I had never experienced before in my life, and I was like, "Whoa, this is awesome!" I didn't know if you smoke plants, this could happen.
What did you see?
Well, I was actually standing in like a median of like a street, and there was like, no, I'm sorry, I was standing in like this plant area next to a sidewalk next to a street. And I remember when the full effects came on, I got transported into like standing on the side of this hill of a ravine, and like the sidewalk was this ravine, and there's like these like rush of horses, and like it was like a cavalry of people on cavalry like on horses stampeding through this ravine. And I was like having to hold on to these bushes because I was feeling the power of this cavalry running through this ravine. And then when I like finally came to, I realized I was just like staring at the sidewalk. So that's like the one and only time I've like been like transported to another time and space on cannabis.
Yeah. Did you smoke it or eat it?
Smoked it out of a steamroller. Do you know what a steamroller is?
I don't. What is that?
It's like this long, it's like a pipe, long pipe, but
I do know what those are. Yeah.
You kind of go like this and put your hand on the end and light the bowl and unleash it. So, you know, once I experienced the wonders of cannabis, I started smoking all the time, and that really was the gateway drug, you can say. DARE program with that language is funny because it really was the opening for me to be like, wow, plants are incredible. And if they can send me to these places and help me have these insights and visions, then, you know, why wouldn't I want them to be in my life? And so then, you know, moving forward, I was quite the party girl in college, you know, drinking a lot, going to frat parties and everything. And I had some pretty traumatizing experiences in the first year and a half of my college experience. And when, I came out of these experiences and not knowing how to really move forward, that's when the mushrooms came into my life. So my friend Sterling, she's kind of my guide for many of my drug experiences, said, Denell, like, do you want to take mushrooms with me? And I'm like, mushrooms? What do you mean? She's like, psychedelic mushrooms. I was like, oh, I thought people go like crazy on those things. But I said yes. And I had just turned 19. And I remember we were actually driving to Armstrong Woods here in Sonoma County in Guerneville. And I was driving, and she had put them in a sandwich. And I have no idea how many she put in there. Like, I don't know the dose. But she's like, here, Denell, eat this. And so I'm eating this sandwich.
And you knew there were mushrooms in that sandwich?
Yes, I knew there were mushrooms.
But just not how much.
But not how much. But when I reflect, I remember seeing some really big mushrooms she was putting in there. And so driving, eating the sandwich, and we get to Armstrong Woods, and, that's when they start to really fully take effect. And I would like to say that it was anywhere from 3.5 to 4 grams, which for a 19-year-old first timer,
that's a lot.
Yeah. My life is characterized from before that experience and after that experience, before mushrooms and after mushrooms. And literally all the veils that I had been put on myself to hide my true magic just got ripped away. And I communed with what I call the more than human world in a way that I hadn't done so since I was a small child. So when I was a very small child, I called myself Doolittle, like Dr. Doolittle, because I could talk to animals and I could talk to trees, and fairies were real. And like it wasn't make believe, it was real life for me. But as, growing up and going to middle school and high school, just that wasn't cool.
Mm-hmm.
So this mushroom journey really cracked open myself and who I am. And I remember this baby redwood tree asked me to dance with it, and I was dancing with this baby redwood tree, and it was shimmering, and all these ancient redwood trees around me were just watching and giving me blessing to connect to them in a very special way. And so after that moment, I was like, oh my God, these are amazing. Psychedelics are amazing. And I then started using them regularly, but I didn't know about the their indigenous roots or the ceremonial sacrament aspect of it until probably 4 or 5 years later, when I was out of college. I had traveled the world. I had gone through more life experience, and the mushroom in particular has always been an ally for me. And I started wondering, why do I feel so connected to the mushrooms? What is it about mushrooms? And I started doing research about, how have these been used in the past? If I love them so much, why? I wonder if other people love them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started learning about the mushroom cult in Mexico, and learning about Amanita muscaria and the Celtic origins and the Siberian origins of using mushroom as a sacrament. And around this time in my life, I started to go deep into exploring spirituality and consciousness, and the who we are as humans in this world and in the cosmos. And I moved away from the party girl and using substances just to escape, to then using them as a way to explore my inner world. And so I wish I had known about how sacred they were when I first started using them, although subconsciously I felt that. I felt the power of these plants. But it took me sitting down and asking the question, I wonder, to actually explore this. And and then I deepened this when I went back to graduate school, and I wrote my master's thesis on the healing potentials of psilocybin mushrooms. And because I was writing a master's thesis, I had to put it in a cultural context. So I, explored the history even more deeply. And so, yeah, I'd say, the sacredness of it is a relatively new thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm grateful for that knowing.
Mm-hmm. So, and would you say, how would you say that the mushrooms have brought healing to you? And would you say that helped you heal from those traumatic experiences that you had in college?
Oh, that's a big question. So one thing that I've noticed about my mushroom journeys is the first few of them were really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Laughing, giggling, rolling on the ground. But as I've gotten older and I have, communed with the mushrooms more often, it's okay, well, we're done showing you our light side. We're going to have you face the darkness now. And so what mushrooms have done for me is shine a light on my inner world where there's darkness, and I need to look at it and I need to process it. And so, with these experiences in college, as well as just experiences in my, early and mid 20s, my MO was to run away. I just didn't oh, that happened. Okay, well, I'm just going to not face that direction and just move forward. But what that led to was my body not integrating those experiences. And so I have a running theory.
What do you mean by that? Just for anyone who might not know what that means.
Sorry, my headphones, I feel like are going to come off. So I have a theory that just came to me in a vision that when, as we in these human forms are moving through time and space, that when we have an experience, whether that's like painful, traumatic, or adverse, if we do not allow that experience to essentially like flow through our body, a piece of our life force energy, a piece of our essence gets essentially stuck in that moment. Mm-hmm. So I like to talk about the time-space continuum as like a loaf. Like if you think of it as like a physical loaf, mm-hmm. So like time and space. And so as we're moving through the space-time loaf and a piece of us is stuck in the past, we become essentially tethered, energetically tethered to that moment in time. So even though our physical body is moving forward in the space-time loaf, that piece of us is still way back here. Mm-hmm. And as we continue and move on through time, that tether becomes strained and taut, and the body is unable to function at its highest possibility because a piece of the life force energy that animates us is stuck in the past. So one way to unhook yourself from the past is by consciously looking at it, is by being like, okay, I'm going to actively remember that moment and allow my body to go through the process it needs to go through to integrate that. And that can be through crying or screaming or shaking or whatever sort of experience your body needs to go through to unhook yourself from that moment in time and essentially untether yourself to bring that piece of you back. Mm-hmm. So what mushrooms have done for me is expose where those tethers have been, or where those tethers are. And they won't untether or unhook me for me. They just essentially point me in this direction, like, oh, like, see, remember this? Like, yeah, this is something you need to actually process. This is something you need to heal, and you're pretending like it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So, I also love the mushrooms for just being able to experience, maybe heightened sense of color and fractal patterns, or like just like galactic images that can pulsate. But in terms of healing myself and in terms of how they have helped me heal, is they show me where I am not wanting to look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of pretty visuals and colors, and mm-hmm. It's fun to kind of be out in the woods and explore.
Yes.
But I'm also most interested in mushrooms and plant medicines for that potential to heal and understand the self.
Right.
Because it can be difficult to access those tethers, like you say. It shows you where they are. Like there's I've experienced so many parts of myself that I forgot about.
Right.
Like during a mushroom experience or ayahuasca ceremony or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
These memories will come up that I totally forgot about or blocked out or
right.
something like that. And there's still energy there, life force energy tied up.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's, in the research that I've done of how peoples in the past have used these plant medicines, that this is why they were used, is to bring about healing to the people. It wasn't just, fun, willy-nilly, I want to get high. It's like, oh, our community needs some healing. And so in particular with the mushrooms is the community would do them together, is they would sit in a circle around the fire and commune with the mushrooms, and then they would integrate together. So after they've had the experience, they would sit around the same fire and talk about what they experienced. And sometimes members of the community would experience things on behalf of another. And so sharing these stories was for the collective. And I feel that when I am with the mushrooms, and I am not as experienced with ayahuasca, but I also felt that with ayahuasca as well. It's like, oh, like we're doing some deep collective healing. Like I'm tuning into my father or, you know, my ancestral lineage, and I'm processing this energy on behalf of them as well. So,
yeah, I think that's an important thing to mention, that indigenous cultures, they didn't use them recreationally. And in fact, it was considered disrespectful to do so.
Right, right.
Taking a sacrament is like going to sit at the feet of a great teacher, you know, with humility, the purpose to learn. Let's talk about intention too, because I feel like that's a very important part for guiding the experience, you know, to take a moment to really get in touch with why we might be taking the sacrament at that particular time. What do we want to get out of it? And, you know, a lot of times I don't necessarily have a goal in mind, but my intention is to receive healing or to receive insight. And I'll just say that, you know, like basically go and sit at the feet of the teacher and say, I'm open to hearing what you have to show me right now. And even though it's so wide open like that, it's still, I feel, is important to have some kind of intentional focal point to guide the experience. It's kind of like bringing an offering to the teacher or showing respect in a way. And but even times where I have had a specific intention of like, oh, you know, I just went through a breakup, and you know, there was a pattern in this relationship that has appeared in many others, or something like that. You know, how I want to discover like what is my role in recreating this relationship pattern, something like that. And it will totally play out in the journey, like in ways that, you know, I didn't necessarily expect.
Yes, I love that you want to speak about intention, because I feel like that's where the true medicine lies, is when you give the medicine a direction. So, you know, I've talked to people about intention, and they're like, why do I need to set an intention? And, you know, my understanding is like, if you just take the plants, or, you know, take the sacrament, and you don't give them any direction, they're just going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to show you something that's way over here, and you might not be able to like use that in your life right now. It might not be the right time. Or I like to think about like the intelligence of the plant just choosing for you what it wants to show you. Whereas if you have an intention and you kind of put a boundary around like what you're wishing to receive, then the medicine can work within that boundary instead of just kind of like, you know, shooting wherever. I think it might be Terrence McKenna who said this. I don't quite remember who, but they said that when you take a plant medicine, you're actually accessing all of the experiences of anyone who has ever, you know, taken that plant medicine. And so that's a lot of information out there that you can tap into. And so setting an intention or having an intention puts a boundary on that. And for me, in my healing process, and when I invite others to use the plant medicines, this is the reason why I tell them to set an intention is, you know, you want to set a boundary so you can actually receive what you want to receive. You know, when I sat in a ceremony, an ayahuasca ceremony with my partner, he didn't have an intention, and he didn't really experience much. Like, it wasn't a visionary experience. It wasn't a mystical experience. Whereas my intention was like really crystal clear, and I got shot to the moon. Like I was like, whoa, okay. Thank you, ayahuasca. And he was a little put off that he didn't really have, you know, the experience that he was hoping. And I was like, well, you didn't set an intention. You didn't have a reason why you wanted to take it. You're just like, oh, I'm just going to sit in ceremony. And so ayahuasca didn't know what to do with that. So those are my thoughts on intention.
Yeah. Are there some specific stories you could share about psychedelic experiences? Maybe really standout ones that were life-shifting points, like that first one that you mentioned, or any others that kind of, when you look back at your whole life, you can see, oh, that was, my whole life shifted from that journey.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'll speak to this ayahuasca experience I just mentioned, which took me over 2 years to integrate from. So before sitting in the ceremony, it was my first time having taking ayahuasca. Ayahuasca had been coming to me over the course of like 3 years prior, where people would mention it to me, certain healer friends, when I would talk to them about like the crises I was experiencing, be like, oh, well, have you taken ayahuasca? And I was always too afraid. And at this time of my life, I was 25. I felt like something was holding me back from actually living my true potential. I explained it like, it felt like I would come up against this invisible membrane and I couldn't like push through it. Mm-hmm. And every teacher of mine, I would explain this to them and they would give me tools and it just never worked. And so finally, for like when ayahuasca came up about like the 12th time, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready.
How was it appearing to you? Like when you say it came to you?
Right. So people would tell me about it. I would see, things on the internet about it. I would hear people talking about it. People would tell me, oh, I just sat in an ayahuasca ceremony. And what I know about spirit medicine, whether it's plant spirit medicine or crystals or whatnot, like when they want to work with you, they'll like keep reminding you about
they'll
them.
Show up
Yes.
from like a myriad of directions in a
Right.
short span of time. That's like very unusual.
Right. So like, see books at the library. I don't know. It's just like random places be like ayahuasca. So, and actually I was working with a woman at the time who facilitated ceremonies. And so that was one of the last straws. I was like, okay, I'm like working with a woman who gives ceremonies. So, okay, I'm just going to say yes. And so my intention for this ceremony was, I asked ayahuasca, please show me what is holding me back. What is this membrane that I am unable to push through? And, drank the medicine and I was shocked at how palatable it was. Like, oh, this isn't that bad. And I remember feeling the medicine starting to kind of course through my DNA and like having visions of it intertwining with my genetic coding. And I was like, okay, ayahuasca, I'm ready. And like ayahuasca like showed me her like this beautiful mandala face. She's like, no, we're going to get to know each other first. Mm-hmm. And then I will, answer your question or your intention. And so at this time, I also took another little dose because I was impatient. And, on this journey, I was shown so many different things about the universe and this life leading up to the big moment, which I'll get to. But, a few of the things that really just transformed my perspective was I was laying outside and I was like watching the stars kind of like swirl into being, and there was a mosquito that was buzzing by my ear, and just out of habit I slapped and killed this mosquito. And me causing that death, all of a sudden the web of life that interconnects us all like sprouted into being. I could see like the 3-dimensional flower of life pattern that like permeated out to the universe. I saw how me causing that death made that web of life kind of like go haywire. Like it like made this like ripple of like static kind of go like out into the universe. I was like, whoa. So like when we intentionally kill something with no purpose and with malice, like we create dissension or I can't think of the word, just distortion in this web of life. And I was just like laying there, like watching my action like permeate through the entire universe. I was like, oh my God, like that's what happens when we do harm. And so, you know, I felt like I really needed to go inside at this time because the medicine was really starting to take over my body. And I went and laid down. And I remember, I think I like wrapped myself in like a cocoon of blankets and just like was like in this incubator. And at this time, I mean, this is like a very chronological story, but it wasn't linear at all. I remember tuning into my father and feeling the deep pain of my father and his family. And I just started like sobbing and crying for my father and realizing like his pain and how he's never really lived a life that he wanted. And as I was like experiencing this like pain from my father, I became consciously aware of not being in my body and that I was like in the void. And I remember like, I also was like looking down and like my body was down there and I was up in some higher plane. I was like, oh my God, this is what it's going to be like to die. Like I am out of my body right now and it's not scary. It actually feels really good. Like I am like a part of the whole and I'm not in pain and I feel really loved at the moment. And so that was really profound to have the experience. I mean, this is an assumption of what it will be like to die. And so my fear of death became greatly reduced, you know, after this journey. And so, you know, there were other experiences and then, you know, hearing people purge around me and like other people were having their own journeys. But the ceremony facilitator like rang a bell and was like, okay, we're all going to come together. That, you know, you should all be kind of completing your journey. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so deep in it right now. Like, what do you mean I have to come sit in the circle? And so I remember I was like crawling into the circle and this like energy just started to well up inside my body. And I was like, oh my God, like what is happening? I'm starting to freak out because everybody seems to be coherent and I am still in it. And I remember my body just started to get so hot and I'm just like ripping off my clothes and I started to like freak out. And I feel this like hard bubble like come from within, like from my reproductive system, you know, belly area. And it starts to like come up out of my body. And I'm like, I'm going to purge. Oh my gosh, I'm going to purge. And so I remember like I turned around to get the bowl and this bubble came out of my throat and out of my body. And what came out of me was this wail. Was this like screaming wail of a sound that I have never made before. And as I was wailing, I was downloaded with all of this remembrance of all the women in my ancestry who had never been able to cry or who were never able to grieve or process their traumas or, it was literally like the cry of 20,000 grandmothers who were never able to do their own healing work. And like there was like 4 or 5 parts of me experiencing this, and ayahuasca was like, this is your answer. That this membrane that you have not been able to push through, it is your ancestral trauma. And you are here to remember this and you are here to process this. And I mean, in terms of time, I don't know how long this went on. But I was just like sobbing and crying and just like remembering, like, you know, I have European ancestry, and like remembering the burning times and remembering all my grandmothers who practiced herbal medicine and mushroom, you know, medicine, and were midwives who like watched their sisters and mothers and aunts like be burned at the stake. I was remembering like even farther back into like the Celtic lineage when the Romans came and raped and pillaged all of, you know, the Celts, and even further back, you know, into the pagan lineage when then like the Iron Age of the Celtic peoples basically decimated, you know, the earth-based religions. And so like this entire soup of trauma just like came pouring out of my body. And I ended up, you know, actual purging a couple times from both ends. And I was like in such a energetic purging state that I actually had to like remove myself from the group and like sleep it off somewhere else because it was just so intense.
Yeah.
And, you know, the next morning I was like, what just happened? And for a good 2 years, I was not fully in my body. Like I wasn't able to relate to my family. I wasn't able to relate to my friends. My partnership was strained because I was like, I don't know how to integrate this information. But with time I did, and with patience and a lot of journaling and art. But that experience was a catalyst to me doing this work in women's health, women's reproductive health, which I do now. And you know, in all honesty, that's actually the only ayahuasca ceremony I sat in because it was just so life altering.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That would take two years to integrate, I think, something. I mean, the last ceremony I did was about 3 years ago, and it can take a while for sure. So gosh, there's so much value to an experience like that, even though it's so intense. Like I remember before I ever drank ayahuasca, I heard stories about it and I was nervous and I was scared because I heard, you know, one person told me that they had this experience where they were in this kind of void space, just they were there and everything else was black. And this giant, huge black anaconda came out of the dark and swallowed them and they died.
Oh my gosh.
And then, but then they were like reborn, and it was the most terrifying experience of their life that they would never want to do again, but they were so happy it happened. It was the best thing that ever happened to them. And I was just like, I don't want that to happen to me. Like, they're like, no, it was amazing. I was like, it's so intense. Like, I mean, how do you just go and sign up for that? Right.
Right.
And then hearing an experience like yours to finally break through that membrane and get beyond that and get to live the rest of your life beyond that kind of threshold that was imposed upon you. Right. But then somehow you have to find the courage to enter, you know, and ayahuasca is not always intense. It can also be super gentle. I just want to say that for people too. But it does take courage, I think, to take psychedelics, especially intentionally for the purposes of healing. It takes courage to shift from that point of your life of running away from the uncomfortable feelings, running away from situations or conflict that you don't know how to deal with, and just kind of like finding that centeredness of being, and even if you're scared, to just kind of like begin to move forward into it and you know, face that. And you know, whether you choose to use psychedelics for that purpose or some other manner, but you know, to confront one's own issues and start on the healing path, it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And it's rare, I think, I think we would all benefit from it, but I think it's not the way that we were taught in this culture of how to deal with things. And so not only does it take personal courage, but you also are going against the grain of society. People might think you're weird. There's all kinds of things that potential obstacles, but
one reason why I think they're not as widely used in our Western culture is because you really have to release all semblance of control.
Yeah.
Like you're not in control at all. And for many people, I think that is what's most scary, is that they're not in control of what they will experience. And that's where the fear comes from, is that you don't know what's going to come up.
You're coming into contact with something that's more powerful than you.
Right. And excuse me, especially in our Western culture, we have been kind of conditioned to think that we are gods, or that we are, invincible, and that's something we don't ever talk about death or think about death. And so to put yourself in a situation where you will be face to face with something that is more powerful than you is humbling. And many people aren't ready for that, to be humbled.
Yes. And interestingly, though, it's comforting, like to get beyond that fear block and really to come and, the spiritual realm beyond the physical realm and ordinary state of consciousness that we experience. It's a wide world. And, not everything out there is like positive, I guess you could say, that's another one of the values of intention, is to intentionally direct one's experience towards healing or towards insight, truth, things like that, because there are like darker energies that one can draw in, which are best avoided. But I understand people's fear or hesitation or caution, because it's kind of like crawling through the armoire into Narnia or something, like as a baby, right? And just like, especially with things like DMT or just the very powerful psychedelics, ayahuasca, humbling is a good word. Like I just go in there, I'm like, oh wow, I'm less than an ant. I am a speck of dust on a speck of dust in this wide universe, and there is consciousness out there that's non-human consciousness that is incredibly powerful, incredibly intelligent, almost omnipotent, and especially some of these plant medicines, the spirit that's in them. Somehow they know more about me than I know about themselves. Than I know about myself, which is interesting. They're showing me myself, like, oh, this is you. I'm like, how do you know me and how do you know everything?
Right.
And speaking on integration, after that experience, to come back to bodily consciousness, ordinary consciousness, with that understanding that we're not in as much control as we trick ourselves into thinking that we are. So what was all that, and how do I apply that to this life? How do I apply that to my everyday, ordinary self? And it's not necessarily easy, but I feel like the psychedelic experience is an introduction to a new perspective, which I feel like is a broader perspective that if we can understand our place in that perspective, there's some peace and solace in it, and there's some comfort in it, in understanding that, like, oh, I'm riding this wave. I don't have to fight so much to control my life. that actually everything's all right. And you can begin to tap into some of that power that exists beyond us, that I come into contact with. And there's a way to let that flow through you. Like you're talking about that loaf of space and time. There's a way to release those anchors and those tethers and kind of like be one with that energy of moving through life, where it's hard to describe. It's very abstract, but it's kind of like riding a wave. It's really fun. You're on surfboard. You're not under, maybe you are kind of balancing, and there's certainly some personal skill in order to like be on that wave, but you have the full understanding that the power that you're riding is not you. You've become one with it, but you are not that powerful. You are not the God necessarily,
Right. I like to think about riding the wave, but we are directing it. Mm-hmm. So depending on one's choices will determine what direction you are pointing in. So, depending on how you take care of your body, in terms of like just taking care of this physical being, like, are you eating healthy foods? Are you moving? Or are you just poisoning yourself and remaining stagnant? That will determine a direction that you are being, guided in. That wave, you're still riding that wave, but perhaps you are facing in a direction you don't want to go. And one thing that psychedelics have helped me understand is that taking care of my physical body, it will help guide me into a place that I want to go to, as well as trusting that when I do take care of my body and I live in what I call like the beauty way, or just, with good intentions, that I will be guided to where I want to go. So taking care of my physical self and then just trusting in that wave.
Mm-hmm. And do you meditate at all? Is that part of your self-care practice?
That is a self-care practice that I am continuously attempting to bring in. I have a lot of energy in my body. And so I find I get into meditative states easier, say, dancing. Mm-hmm. Like not necessarily like partner dancing, but like trance dancing, essentially. Mm-hmm.
Releasing the mind through movement.
Yes. Seated meditation, I have been on a journey with probably since I was like 23, and I'm still working on it.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's hard to develop a consistent practice.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah, and then like on social media, I see so many people like, oh, I have a daily meditation practice. And I'm like, oh, I don't. Mm-hmm. I try, but, I do other things. But it is something I would like to develop.
I ask because one of the messages I was repeatedly getting from my psychedelic experiences was to meditate, because I noticed that because basically I meditate during a psychedelic experience, definitely ayahuasca ceremonies. I'm mostly seated in one place with my eyes closed much of the time. But also on mushrooms, especially like higher doses will bring on this energy that I just want to tune into, and I'll just sit and close my eyes and go into that. Mm-hmm. But I'll notice when I'm in that space that my mind is just so wild, that like I want to focus on that energy, like I want to deepen into it, and I want to really like get to know its essence and like, I don't know, there's just something magical out there to like tease out of that. But then my mind will just hijack the plane and just go off in this direction or that direction. I have to keep coming back. Mm-hmm. And the message I kept getting was, if you do a little bit of regular meditation and just practice sitting and focusing your mind, then not only will you have greater peace throughout your day in general, but you'll have greater resources available to you to focus in on the things that you want to focus in on, be it in the psychedelic experience or not. And it's even so, getting that message multiple times, it still took me a while to like develop a regular practice, and then I'd fall off, and then I'd start again. But there is something, and I there's something that's difficult about it, that it's hard for me to stick to, and many other people. And I know so many people have said, oh yeah, meditation, that's like, I know I need to do that. Like we know.
Yeah, we do.
But I think that it's, in a way, it takes the same amount of courage that it takes to do a psychedelic experience, but in a way even more, because coming into contact with the power of the mushrooms or the power of ayahuasca, it gives you something to work with. There's like a psychic pressure, or there's a presence there. There's sort of some guidance. It brings you places, you know, it's just like entering into a dream, and you're there, but the whole dream is happening around you. But during meditation, in just ordinary consciousness, you're just sitting there with the full force of your own chaos. And for me, it's I don't know if it's just uncomfortable to sit in that and just recognize like, wow, I'm super unfocused. Just having a hard time even just sitting here doing nothing. It's so difficult.
It is so difficult. So do you have a regular meditation practice?
I do.
How long do you sit for?
Well, I think about meditation the way I think about physical exercise, in that if you're out of shape, when you start exercising again, it hurts. And you're like sore the next day. And there's a period of time, I guess it depends on how out of shape you are, but there's a period of time where you just have to keep doing it and it hurts. Right. And then eventually you start to acclimate, and then eventually it feels really good. And if you don't exercise for a few days, then you're like, oh, I'm so stiff and sore, and you kind of start to crave it. And I think of meditation as exactly that way. So right now I'm in the process of getting back in shape. I'm doing like 20 to 30 minutes per day, which is manageable. But in the past I've done an hour a day or 2 hours per day, which is a big, it's a big commitment, even just time wise for busy people. But right. Yeah, I got like really in shape where I just wanted to meditate a lot. And there's something that happens where, like, most people who don't have a practice or haven't kind of like gotten in meditative shape haven't had the experience of like a deeply clear mind, you know? And I think that's worth mentioning, because it's like there's something to get out of it that maybe most people aren't aware of. And if you're just like, okay, I'm going to meditate, and you sit down for an hour and try and sit for an hour, it's like excruciating, and it's hard, and it takes time to see results. Like, you have to do it every day for at least a couple weeks to really start to feel the benefits. And you have to just like push through that initial, several weeks of discomfort. But yeah, there's something magical that happens when eventually, without exercising effort to do so, I'll just notice myself meditating in a place of clarity, where my breathing is just really regular and steady. My mind has just quieted down and it's just kind of like seated within me. And I'm sitting in a place of awareness, and I'm not really thinking about anything. And I'm not exerting myself physically or mentally. And there's something deeply restorative about being in that place. And it's tricky because, like, I would love to just sit down and be in that place, but you can't, or I can't, endeavor to get there. It's kind of, you sort of have to relax into that place rather than, there's nothing I can do. It's actually the absence of doing to be in that place. And periods in my life where I was meditating regularly, I was able to achieve that state, not every time, but more and more often. And then I found that having done the bulk of the work to even get there in the first place and continue to get there and continue to like have my mind seated deeper within my being, when I wasn't in meditation, I would walk around in the world and I was so clear, you know, or like the little things that would bother me, you know, just like, I don't know, little stuff like being stuck in traffic or somebody being a little bit rude or whatever, just didn't care. Like I could see it for what it was, that you know, it didn't have anything to do with me. Somebody being rude, it's like that I didn't take it personally. It's just so many things were just like water off of a duck's back, you know, and I was able to maintain that clarity. And but even more than that, the things that I had to do in my life, you know, my tasks or whatever I was trying to develop, my projects, I could see the clear route to what I wanted to do. And it's kind of hard to explain, but there's like a visionary quality that I got into touch with, of just like, oh, like I see how to not waste effort. I see exactly what it is I want to accomplish and how to get there. And I have the energy to do so. I'm not exhausted. Like I can just operate effectively. So yeah. And then, you know, life happens and sometimes you spiral out from that place, because it does take a commitment to do that every day. And I feel better when I do longer sits, but even just doing 5 minutes per day, the consistency aspect is even more important than the time. So like if somebody wanted to meditate for, say, 10 minutes a day for 30-day period and just commit, like I can find 10 minutes a day every day for this month, you'll see results. So it doesn't actually take that much time, but there's a lot to gain from practicing that, you know, practicing just being and noticing the parts of the mind that want to do, like, oh, am I doing this right? Judging myself. Oh, I'm slouching. Oh, like my mind just wandered away again. I suck at this. You know, I mean, it's actually hard to maintain focus and presence even for a solid minute in a relaxed fashion. And I like to say that if I am meditating, I'm doing it right. Like if I have made it past all of the excuses to not meditate and I'm sitting down, I'm doing it right, you know? And there are better ways to do it, but there's no wrong way to meditate. That's how I think of it. Because when I was first beginning my practice, I had so much judgment of like, what is meditation? What's the goal of meditation? And you know, I'm terrible at it and I'm doing it wrong. And it was so stressful. Yeah. I was like, this is supposed to be relaxing. It's the complete opposite. I'm super stressed out just sitting here with my eyes closed. This is terrible.
Getting angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I eventually realized, I'm like, no, that's not, that's not where it's at. So
I've been through many of the experiences you just spoke to, and the last period of my life, I had a very consistent meditation practice. I felt the most clear I have in my entire life. And it was actually when I was finishing graduate school, and I like really devoted to my meditation practice. And the school I went to actually had a meditation room, which is amazing. So I just go in the middle of class periods and go and sit. But then it's like, once I was done with grad school, I was like, okay, I don't have to do anything with the discipline anymore. So yeah, I've been feeling the call to get back into it However, I've noticed that for me right now, what I'm working on right now actually is sobriety from cannabis, because cannabis kind of like took over my life, and I'm not allowing her into my field anymore for the time being. And I can sense within my body that this next period of meditation will be even more profound, I guess you can say. I don't know, that's maybe not the right word, but
fruitful.
I like that word, fruitful, because my energy field will be clear and I won't have the energy of cannabis around me, even though I wouldn't like be high all the time, but you know, I might have gotten high like 4 hours ago or like 10 hours ago and it's still in my system, but now I'm completely clear. And so I've allowed my body to like go through this process first, and now I'm like do my seated practice. I'm glad we're talking about this.
Yeah.
Reminding me.
Yeah. Did you, how long have you been sober from cannabis?
Since January 1st.
Okay. So almost 2 months. Did you, when I first stopped smoking cannabis, I noticed it took about 2 weeks or so, but there was this really subtle cloud that had been over my mind that I didn't notice until it was gone. It took about 2 weeks to kind of like fully lift off. Or maybe even more than that. But the threshold amount to be like, oh, whoa. Like I have access to parts of my intellect that I kind of lost touch with a little bit. Did you have a similar experience?
Yes. It was actually very profound for me. I felt like I had been living life with like cotton balls over my third eye. It's just like the sense of a cloud hanging over. It was very visceral for me. And I'm a recovering codependent. And
what does that mean?
So, you know, I say I'm recovering because I'm aware of my codependent behaviors and I'm actively working on not engaging in them. So for me, codependency manifests as manipulation of situations to make myself be presented and seen in a certain way. So I'm like a chameleon, so I can change who I am to make the other like me or feel happy with me, or those are the two big ones, liking me and feeling happy with me. I also, my codependent behaviors manifest as manipulating people to by way of making them think they're making decisions for themselves, but I'm actually driving the situation so that I'll feel safe. So codependency comes from a sense of lack of safety in oneself, and it usually stems from people who have parents or family members that are alcoholics or that drug abusers, and it's from in early childhood our nervous systems are imprinted with like emotional patterns, and codependency stemming from having parents who drink alcohol comes from the fact that when our parents were inebriated, we weren't being met with emotional safety or emotional recognitions in the way that our nervous system needed. And so for me, that manifested as like feeling like I needed to save my family, and like the only way that I would know how to do that would to make them happy with me. So I was really good at school. I like was the goody. I didn't do anything bad. I didn't like cross my parents, because as long as they were happy with me, then my family unit would be safe. And I put that on myself. So in the years that I smoked cannabis, it started out as fun and, laughing, giggling, having the munchies, turned into like crippling anxiety. And it would just like spark these codependent behaviors of like manipulating people and they wouldn't even know I'd be manipulating them because I was that good at it.
That's like one of my greatest fears, is like being manipulated in that fashion. It's like somebody pulling my strings, you know?
Right. And actually it's amazing how many people, mainly women, I'd say most codependents that I've met are women, have this tendency. And like people, when they hear the word codependency, they think, oh, they're just like addicted to a relationship, or like they are, fueling someone else's addiction. And that's part of it. Like you can be codependent with someone, and in order for you to feel valued or worthy of living, is based upon their opinion of you. But there's more to it. And as I, dove into learning about these behaviors and learning about my inability to have healthy relationships because of this nervous system imprintation, I began to realize how much cannabis evoked these behaviors within me. And I know this to be like cannabis, like showing me like, hey, you need to look at this. But I didn't look at it for years. And I have a partner who refuses for me to be codependent with him. And he's always like, Denell, like, stop. Like, what are you doing? And he'll like call me out when I fall back into those patterns, and I'll try to manipulate him. I won't even know I'm doing it.
Right.
It's just so ingrained in who I am. He's like, you're trying to control me. Why are you controlling me? And I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing it. He's like, what's wrong? I'm like, I just don't feel safe right now. And like, that's always the underlying cause, is codependents don't feel safe. So it's like that root chakra, family unit, instability. And so now that I am clear of cannabis, like I had periods last year where I didn't use it, but then I always had this thought like, oh, I can just like use it once in a while. But it's like, as soon as I used it once, I would just like fall back into the pattern of using it every day. But now that I've made like a pact with cannabis, I'm like, no, like I honor you and I love you because you really showed me a lot of my life, but I can't have you in my body system right now. I feel like this switch, this turnaround where I think the codependency, I now feel like I'm in recovery. And so that's why I say I'm a recovering codependent. I don't need to manipulate people anymore. I can be my authentic self, and I can be who I actually am, and I will be loved. And I can also receive love that people are giving me. And actually, I don't know if the camera see, but I got these tattoos on my fingers actually to signify that. So like this, the fourth finger here is considered like the Venus finger or the love finger. And so it's just a reminder that I can give and receive love and not have to control or manipulate. I can trust that. So.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're talking about this and bringing this up. I've experienced a lot of I've experienced a lot of attempts to manipulate me. Like I said, it was one of my greatest fears. I was manipulated a lot when I was younger, and I've developed an eye for it. You know, there's a feel to when someone's pulling on me, right? But I noticed that most people don't even know that they're doing it, you know, and I'll point it out. Like it pretty much appears constantly in my own personal relationships, my own romantic relationships, much more than friendships. But yeah, like I don't know, it's a silent plague.
It is. It affects a lot of people. And like I said, I mean, I know there are codependent men.
Sure.
But almost every codependent that I've met, or a person who resonates with the definition of codependency, are women. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like this lack of sense of safety. And, you know, as I've done my own ancestral work and looking at the history of, you know, how women bodies have been treated, or how female forms have been, worked with throughout the millennia. I'm not surprised why women don't feel safe. Mm-hmm. So it's like having to manipulate and control their surroundings so we just feel safe. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think security is a big part of it too. Mm-hmm. Something I've encountered a lot in my relationships is a fear of abandonment.
Right.
And I think that my past partners have derived some emotional security from me or from our relationship, that it's a point of stability for her, a point of security. And there's a fear of losing that, mm-hmm. of being abandoned and then being out on one's own again. And I've noticed that the women that don't exercise that need to manipulate or desire to, they're much more secure in themselves, much more independent, and kind of more comfortable, like being on their own, and kind of, mm-hmm. I don't know, it's more self-directed. Mm-hmm. But I think, I think that men probably struggle with that too. There's varying degrees, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not their fault. It's literally a nervous system, like reptilian brain conditioning, mm-hmm. and it's unconscious behavior patterns. And so most people who are codependent don't know that they are, and they're just operating in this continuous like fight, flight, or freeze, that they're just always feeling unsafe in their life and in their relationships. And it comes out mostly in romantic partnerships, because our energies become so intertwined, and you start to really see the person for who they are, and you play a mirror for one another, and those behaviors just become accentuated. Mm-hmm. But I've seen them in my own life. I've exercised codependent behaviors with employers, mm-hmm. and with teachers.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that it's a natural part of the human animal to some extent. Mm-hmm. It's like a survival instinct, mm-hmm. to want to be, included in the tribe. Because our brains are tens or hundreds of thousands of years old, well beyond modern society and civilization, when humans were in much smaller groups of people, and the repercussions of being an outcast were severe, right. if not deadly. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's probably some powerful biological mechanisms that keep us wanting to be loved, or wanting to be accepted and well liked, in good standing in the tribe. Or, we're no longer in tribes, but we still kind of behave like that.
Right. We can't eliminate that.
I think we can overcome it,
right.
But it takes a lot of awareness. You have to dig into that part of the self, and first understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then I'm seeking security from this other person. How can I derive that from within myself? I'm desperate for love from other people. Well, does that mean I'm not loving myself enough? Or right. what's the way that I can get to that in a more direct route?
Right. What needs aren't being met? Did the thing turn off?
I might have lost a camera. Yeah, okay, it's back on. I don't know why it turned off, but it did. That's fine.
It is.
Well, I want to talk about some other things too.
Sounds good.
I want to talk about your wellness practice, but first I wanted to ask you about your interest in history, because you have a history minor, don't you? Is that right?
Oh, that's my bachelor's. I have my bachelor's.
Your bachelor's.
In
history. Okay.
Yes.
So, I have an interest in history as well, so I wanted to ask you about that. I don't have formal academic studies, but just personal interest and have studied a lot of history on my own. So did you have a particular focal point of history, a particular time period that you are drawn to, or?
Yeah, well, while I was in undergrad, I really became fascinated with African history, which unfortunately I was drunk and high a lot of the time, so I can't regurgitate much of the information. But I've always had a draw to like ancient civilizations, ancient history. And I had a professor named Professor Brantley, who she was an ethno-historian of Eastern African tribes. And so it's like a mix of anthropology and history. And she just blew my mind. I was like, this is amazing history that I had never heard about. Africa is a huge continent.
Huge.
And there's
much larger than people realize.
Yeah, it's ginormous. And I mean, there were kingdoms that lasted thousands of years there that were really influential to like Asian history and European history. And so I really got into African history. And then I also had an interest, during my time at UC Davis in post-industrial America, actually. So Industrial Revolution on, and I got really into like conspiracy theories and
cool.
and looking at, what the history books say happened versus what actually might have happened. And now I'm really interested because I'm on this like ancestral remembrance path at the moment of old Europe. And really I've been most interested recently in the history of how people healed and how people took care of themselves and how like the history of medicine essentially. But I love history. To me, it's like a story time. And one of my psychic abilities is I'm able to like transport myself back into that time and be able to like viscerally experience what is being talked about. Or like if I go to like an ancient site or like a place where people once were, I am able to like be in that time when it was. And so
there's a word for that.
Is it?
There's actually, I can't remember what it is, unfortunately, in this moment, but there's a word for being in places or touching objects and like receiving information about the history of that object.
Interesting.
Like
I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah. I wish I could remember what the word is. It's a very specific word.
Yeah, it was when I was at UC Davis where I realized, I was like, oh my God, like I'd be listening to a lecture and I'd be sitting there like taking notes and, watching the slides, but my spirit or something was like in ancient Mali or like in, the gold mines of South Africa.
I wonder if you had a history flashback that first time you smoked cannabis and you saw like cavalry running down the hill.
Maybe.
If like that happened, 150 years ago or something, or 100 years ago.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting for me to now like be around in this area. I have to actually turn off this ability because I'm like my parents, they actually live in Santa Rosa in my childhood home. I always felt like strange and like I've had experiences with ghosts and there was definitely a ghost that lives there, but like the land where the subdivision has always felt weird to me. And just a few years ago I decided to like open myself up and like tune into the land, and there were some really terrible things that happened there, and then they just like bulldozed all the oaks and built houses on top. I'm like, oh my God, no wonder this land feels so strange. On it touching an object. So why do you like history?
Well, I was hoping that you would talk about post-industrial America.
Oh, okay. I can do that. Like why I was interested in that? Or?
Well, so I got interested. I think that's what got me more interested in history was, I don't know. I was a good student too. I learned the history that they taught me. I didn't fully swallow the pill though. There was something about it that I don't know, just didn't feel right, but I didn't know what it was. But there's conspiracy theory and there's conspiracy fact, and there are known facts in American history of conspiracies that were contrived and executed that are the opposite of what we were told in school. And I think they still teach this, even though we now know for sure that. So let's see, one example, we're taught that in World War I, the United States entered the war in Europe because the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat.
Right.
And the Lusitania was just like a passenger cruise liner or something like that, a non-combative vessel that the Germans sunk, and that was an act of war, and that's what brought us into the war. But we now know for a fact that the United States was sending war materials to Britain, and the Germans were attacking those boats, and they decided, we're gonna send war materials through cruise liners and things like that, passenger ships, to ferry bombs and ammunition and stuff like that to support the war effort in Britain. And the Germans knew about it, and they said, hey, you are the United States, you're supposed to not be in this war. If you continue to do this, we'll consider you an enemy combatant and we'll be forced to attack you. We ignored that. And they kept sending boats over, and then one of their subs sunk our boat. And so that's fact. And we don't know the thought process of the American government at that time, but we think that they wanted that to happen. That they knew that would happen. It would give the United States an excuse to enter the war. The American government wanted to enter the war. American corporations that had now invested a lot in Britain and would only get paid if Britain won. So the power elite of America was invested financially in Britain winning, and they wanted to enter the war to make sure that we would come out on top. But the American public was very, very against entering the war. They absolutely did not want to get involved in Europe's war at all. So it would have been extremely unpopular politically. They had to create some kind of motive, some kind of public outrage, right, in order to justify entering the war. And the Lusitania was it. So, but they still teach in history books, or at least when I was in school, that we were the victims of this brutal, vicious attack by the Germans.
Right. I believe the term is false flag operation.
Yeah, right.
Yes. I think that's something that has happened more than once.
Multiple times.
Many times. And
some proven, some unproven.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to go from there, but it's the post-industrial United States stories are just fascinating because so much changed so quickly. Mm-hmm. And
what era what's the post-industrial era? Where does that start?
So let's say like mid 1880s mm-hmm. to present.
Sure.
Yeah. So like that,
that was really the period of the rise of the United States as a superpower, too.
Right. The massive immigration, the world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of capitalism, the real transformation of the way government handles people, government handles our life. I grew fascinated with how quickly things transformed, and just to think about what happened from the year 1900 to 2000. I mean, the United States went through so many different iterations, and it's more than any other country in any other time period in the world. And so, going back to, false flag operations, I feel like that those sorts of things like the Lusitania is what helped propel the United States through this change is by forcing change, essentially.
Totally.
So, yeah, I'm not sure what exactly you want to talk about there.
Oh, I don't know. I
yeah.
just wanted to touch on it for a moment because we share that interest. But yeah, the interesting thing is, there was deceit in the American government. Also a similar incident, World War II, of prior knowledge of the Japanese fleet approaching Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And also the United States kind of like acting against Japan in a non-military fashion in the Pacific, kind of impeding their progress and, basically kind of provoking an attack. But anyway, interestingly, even though there was deceit on the part of the American government, the United States' role in World War I and World War II basically brought us from like a non-important country in the world in 1900 to the most powerful nation in the world by the end of World War II. Not just the military outcome, but more so the economic outcome. Just a term that, because Europe was the power center of the world at that point, post-colonial, and there was a massive transfer of wealth from Europe to the United States. And they got devastated by both of those wars, and we came out on top as a superpower. And so our parents' generation and our generation, we are living in the greatest country in the world, but, we benefit from basically these wars. And, certainly World War II and stopping the Nazis was important, but, they went against what the public wanted. The elite of the country guided us into those actions through manipulation. Because in World War II, also, the American public didn't want to get involved.
Right. Right. The American public doesn't want to get involved in most wars. I mean, same thing with Vietnam War. We were just kind of standing on the side of the French and being like, no, this Vietnam, you need to remain a French colony. Mm-hmm. And the Vietnamese people wanted their independence. And so the United States clearly has been just a bully in this fashion. But that's my own opinion. That's clearly not based on fact. That's just my own assessment.
I think that's true. And I think that the United States gets a bad rap, certainly around the world. I think a lot of other people, other countries learn a truer history of the United States than we learn in our own schools. We learn propaganda. And I think that we deserve some criticism, right? But I also, part of me, trying to be more objective and fair, I think that looking at a broader history, it's like, it's been a game of dominance and control of nations over another. And if it wasn't the United States, it might have been some other dominant country, might have been Russia, might have been Germany, if they had won World War I or World War II.
Right, and Japan.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of nations out there with imperialist aspirations, and we just happen to be the winner. And so, we get a lot of the boo-hooing. But I think it's a human mentality, unfortunately, more than a American mentality. Right.
And I think we get the boo-hooing because the United States imperialist nature occurred during the time of mass media and like photography and videography. But if you look at Britain and their imperialist history, I mean,
and the French.
And the French in Belgium and, the way that Africa was taken over. I mean, if there was mass media during that time and it was recorded how they treated, the humans there, they would have been equally, if not more, criticized. It's just today we live in an era where, anybody can take a photo or a video and put it on the internet, and
the truth of the matter gets out so much more easily.
Right. Right. Exactly. And, I know there's criticism about China, taking over, Chinese thinking like Bhutan or Tibet are part of China, but Tibetans and is it Bhutanese? I don't know how to.
Sure. That sounds right.
They're like, no, we are, we're our own countries. And, but because I think media is more restricted there, it's not getting out as quickly. And the spotlight is on the United States right now because of what's currently happening politically. But one thing I just recently realized and thought of is how there are American military bases all over the world, and it's like
hundreds.
How strange.
Yeah.
We have military bases all over Europe and in Japan and
Everywhere.
Everywhere. But if any other country would attempt to do that, we'd get upset anyway.
Yeah.
The hypocriticism is
the United States has I'm not sure the exact number, but well over 100 military bases in other countries,
right,
that we know of,
right,
and there are secret bases too,
right. For some reason 153 is coming up. I don't know.
I thought it was like 180, somewhere in that range, but that's quite a lot.
That's a lot, and that's a lot of American people that live there.
Yeah.
So history.
And we dominate other countries into letting us have that, like what country would be like, oh yeah, I want the most powerful military country in my backyard.
Right.
But, I read this book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which was fascinating. And I think he was part of the CIA, but he talked about some of the strategies used by the American government and intelligence agencies to get other countries to do what we want. That we have certain points of leverage, economic, diplomatic, political, military, even assassinations, to coerce other countries into doing, we're basically a bully,
Right. Or maybe we're codependent. I don't know.
Maybe.
Manipulating the world. Just
maybe one day we'll sort this all out.
Yeah. United States needs to take a dose of entheogens.
Yeah. Well, we're 2 Americans doing it. Maybe more will join. We'll start to wake up out of the fog of propaganda and start to realize what's going on, hopefully. I mean, when I see the news, like if someone, I don't have cable TV, but if someone I know is watching the news, like for example, my partner's parents, his father, watches the nightly news religiously. Mm-hmm. And if I'm over at their house and I'm watching the news with them, it is just so freaking clear how it's just pure propaganda. And I'm like, this looks like a reality TV show. Mm-hmm. And they're so aggressive with their graphics and their tone.
Right.
Aggressive.
It's like, whoa, like I can see right through it. But then I look at, his family and they're just eating it up and, they regurgitate the talking points. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy.
It's very sophisticated. They use very sophisticated psychological methods to hook people in. Emotional manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Through television programming.
Yeah, exactly. Programming your mind.
Right. People don't realize the actual word is telling you what is actually happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
My friend also likes to point out friend of mine, Johnny Coyote, the word government breaks what government means is govern is to control and mente is mind.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, see, words really tell the truth. They're spells, casting spells. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Spelling, have you heard that one? When we speak, we're spelling. Mm-hmm. Casting spells.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your wellness practice.
Oh, okay.
So, what's the name of your business?
So...
Or what do you call it? Yeah.
Right. So I'm my registered business name is different. But I have I call it a project. It's called Cervical Wellness.
Mm-hmm.
And I work in the field of women's health. So I educate, inform, and empower women to be in charge of their gynecological and reproductive health and to make informed decisions thereof. So I mainly work with women who have abnormal pap smears. So pap smear is a gynecological exam that women go through. Used to be every year, but now because of insurance and Obamacare, it's every 3 years, which I think is not a good idea. Because one thing about women's reproductive health is, unlike in male anatomy, everything is inside of our bodies. And unless, when something is wrong, we can't know. We don't know unless you have like severe pain or abnormal menstruation cycles or whatnot. So my work is really about helping women not be afraid of this region of their body. Many women have a lot of shame and fear and guilt when it comes to their reproductive health, their reproductive system, their sexual organs, and to not give their power over to the doctors when it comes to this region of their body. I do a lot of education. So I just talk to women and men about like what's going on inside of a woman's body, like what is actually happening. And with men, like what are you interacting with when you engage in sex? I focus my work on the cervix, which is a portion of the female reproductive system that is like, it's called the tip of the uterus. It sits at the end of the vaginal canal. So it's the portion of the woman's body that gets examined during a pap smear. And it becomes gravely affected when exposed to HPV, the human papillomavirus, which then, if not taken care of, can manifest into cervical cancer. And so cervical cancer rates are on the rise all over the world. And I work with women to not only address the physical reasons why there is like unwellness there, but also work on the emotional and energetic reasons as well, which generally have to do with relationship to sex, relationship to one's own sexuality and sexual being, and going back to those emotional tethers, processing of adverse sexual experiences.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about HPV, because it's I should know more about it, but is HPV the one that like almost everyone has?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So HPV is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
There are actually about 150 strains of HPV, and they can be carried in the throat and the mouth, in the vaginal canal, in the anal canal, and also on the head, shaft, and base of the penis. So it is a sexually transmitted infection, although you can pass HPV via kissing as well, because it can be harbored in the mouth.
And if it's in the mouth, does it spread to the whole body, or it just stays locally?
No, it can just stay locally. If you ever have any sort of like canker sores in the mouth, that means you have a strain of HPV.
And is HPV different than herpes?
No, it's the same thing.
Oh, okay.
So herpes is a strain of HPV. So there are strains of HPV that don't manifest as anything. You just have them in your system. Now, the reason why HPV is talked about so much in terms of women's health is because there are 5 strains of HPV that cause cancer in the cervix. And if a male is carrying the strain of HPV on his penis, he won't know he has it, because unlike other strains of HPV, which will manifest as genital warts, these strains of HPV on a male body doesn't really do anything. And so he can just be a carrier of it.
And there's no test for it. Is that correct?
You know, I've been doing some research into this. I think there are tests being developed, although I don't think it's easy to get. Like, you can't just go to a Planned Parenthood and be like, I want to be tested for HPV. Although I think it is changing because of how rapidly this virus is spreading. It is like an epidemic, how many people have it. When I looked at the statistics, this was like 4 years ago, and these might have been from like the 2010 census. Over 79 million Americans have HPV, and that's that they know of.
Yeah.
So.
And that's any strain of HPV, or that's not the 5
No, that's not.
ones,
No, that's not the 5 cancer-causing one. That's any HPV. And so it is said that most sexually active Americans will contract HPV at some point in their life. Now, what will make HPV then transform into, say, like cervical cancer is when the immune system of a human body, of the female body, is not strong enough to combat the virus. And so the HPV virus is just like the cold virus. So it's like if your immune system is healthy, it can do what it needs to do and, you know, stave off the virus. Although it's just like the chickenpox virus, that once you have it in your system, you'll always have it. So it's important to take that into consideration. I have women say like, oh, well, I had HPV when I was 19 or 18 and then it went away, but now I'm 32 and it's back. Like, what does that mean? I'm like, well, either you were exposed to another strain or your immune system was compromised in some way and it like flushed out again. So let's see. I'm not, where shall I go from here?
Well, how did you get into this field?
So I got my master's in integrative health, and while I was in grad school, you know, we were learning all about different ways of healing, about health in general, about what I call lifestyle medicine. So how the way you live your life affects your overall health and wellness. And the reason I went to grad school in this field is because I wanted to learn more about healing. That, you know, going way back to the beginning of our conversation when I said I, you know, got deep into spirituality and healing modalities, I wanted to learn more and I wanted to help people heal essentially, but I was never called to doing like body work or you know, herbalism. I wanted to learn like broad brush strokes. How can people heal? So while I was in graduate school, I was also going through my own healing journey. So I was diagnosed with HPV and cervical dysplasia, which that's just like a fancy term that means abnormal cells on the cervix, when I was 19. And those are co-diagnoses that usually come when the doctor says your pap test came back abnormal. So a woman will go get a pap smear and it's either normal or abnormal. And if it's normal, that means nothing's wrong down there. If it's abnormal, it means you have cervical dysplasia.
Sounds scary.
It's so scary, but it's just a really fancy term that means you have some abnormal cells. And if left unchecked, those abnormal cells will continue to mutate and become even more abnormal, which can then lead to cervical cancer. So
when you get that diagnosis of cervical dysplasia, it has to be addressed at that point, or is that, because I know that I don't know as much as I could or should about this, but there's some tests where they like go and like take a sample of the cells on the cervix. That's different than a pap smear, right? They like grab off part of your cervix, right? And then test it.
Yes, it's called a colposcopy.
Okay.
And it's like a biopsy of the cervix where it's like, if you think of like a little hole punch, they, like, so the cervix, if looking, so I wish we had a photo, but if like you were looking through the vaginal canal, the cervix sits at the very end, and it's like this little round body part. It's pretty small. It's like
kind of looks like a donut.
It does look like a donut. So the cervix has a face, and it has a mouth, which is the cervical os, and it's like the neck of the uterus. So it has a face, a mouth, and a neck. So it's like a little one of like the woman just down there. And when you have a colposcopy, they take biopsies at the 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock around the cervical os. So there's a portion of the cervix where these abnormal cells occur, and it's called the transformation zone, or the squamo-columnar junction. And what that is the cervix, the way it regenerates and grows cells is like a torus. So from the inside of the cervical os, which is the mouth, cells will grow outward and like come to the face. And so as the cervix...
From the inside of the donut to the outside of the donut.
Essentially, yes. And so the cells on the inside of the cervical canal, those are called columnar cells, which are very long, skinny cells. Yet as they travel and move through the cervical canal and come out to the face, they change shape, and they become squamous cells, which are very short, fat cells. So the cells of the cervix are literally going through a transformation, and the region in which they go through this metamorphosis is right around the outside of the opening of the hole, or the donut hole, the cervical os, and that's called the transformation zone. And so if you think of like when a caterpillar is metamorphosizing into a butterfly, in that in-between state, it's very vulnerable and very susceptible to damage. And that is true for these cells as well. So a pap smear is essentially just like a quick swab of this area to get a general assessment to see how these cells are transforming. The doctors will look to see like, okay, do I see any abnormalities in this area? And then the pap smear is just to get like a broad brushstroke. Okay, how is this going? And if the pap smear shows like, oh, maybe there's something wrong here. Oh, and she has HPV. Well, we want to get a closer look at what exactly is going on here. And so they'll take what's called a colposcopy. And that's what they do. Like they take like a chunk out of the cervix, which doesn't feel good. It's not like with any anesthesia or anything. It's like, it makes you bleed and it's painful. To get a better understanding of what grade of cervical dysplasia there is. So there's like SIN 1. I don't remember what SIN means. It's like some long acronym. SIN 1, 2, or 3. And then there's like carcinoma in situ, which is like just about cancer. And then there's cancer. So the reason why I got into this is because I had this. I had HPV and SIN 2 cervical dysplasia. So it was like just beyond beginning abnormality, like into like full on abnormal cells. And my doctors told me, because you're so young, you should be able to heal, because the cervix is always forming new cells, just like every other part of our body. It's like continuously moving to a place of homeostasis, balance, and health. And so because I was so young, the doctors told me that, oh, you should be able to heal. And they didn't give me any tips or insights or wisdom or knowledge. And so I just...
Were they saying that you might just heal on your own?
Yeah. And that
your body
happens.
would just take care of it?
Yeah, and that happens often for women who are diagnosed at a young age. So I just lived my life. And as I said before, I was kind of a wild party girl and I didn't take care of myself. And I had a lot of, unprotected sex when I wasn't actually fully aroused. And, that's like a whole other thing about safety of the cervix in sex for women, and the importance of foreplay and the importance of being fully aroused before allowing penetration, which I can get into in a little bit. So, long story short, for 4 years, I had this diagnosis and I had 7 colposcopies.
Wow.
I experienced a lot of medical bullying. I remember my doctor telling me, well, you just need to stop having so much sex.
You thought that was... She thought that was like a contributing factor to...
I guess.
And now knowing what you know, is that ridiculous for her to say that?
I wish you would have said, maybe wait until you're fully aroused before you allow someone to enter into you. And if you feel pain in your cervix when you're having sex, then that is damaging your cervix. But to tell a woman just to stop having sex is not really, doesn't really.
It's not reasonable.
No.
It's not going to happen.
No. So after 4 years of this diagnosis, I got sent away to another doctor, actually a teaching hospital, because I wasn't listening to my doctors. I wasn't getting the surgeries. The only treatment options are to get the HPV vaccine. And I was like, well, if I have the vaccine, if I have HPV already, why would I need the vaccine? Like, that just doesn't make sense. Or the other options were surgeries. So essentially they deface, or they shave off the face of the cervix in hopes of just physically removing the cells will stop it. Or there's like cryosurgery where they burn the cell. they freeze the cells off. Basically it's just, let's cut away the bad in hopes that it will be okay. And those options just never settled well with me. I was around.
So did you move up from Sin 2 where they were wanting to explore some of those more invasive options?
I actually had moved up from Sin 1 to Sin 2.
Oh, okay. So that's when they started.
Right. Well, they give those options right off the bat.
Oh, okay.
Like, as soon as a woman has cervical dysplasia, even Sin 1, which is like basic, like cells are starting to show some abnormalities, they'll be like, oh, let's just cut it off. And that just, my own body was telling me like, no, please don't do that to me. Please don't do that to me. Because they do it maybe under general anesthesia or maybe no anesthesia. And the cervix is extremely sensitive. Women can have cervical orgasms because of how many nerves are there. And it's, I didn't want to do it. Yeah. So I went to this teaching hospital and I had I think it was my final colposcopy, and it was an actual OBGYN, and I was in this teaching hospital room. So like, if you think back to like House or, any of those shows about hospitals, or there's like the little table with like the big room with seats all around. Like, I was in one of those rooms, but it was just me and the doctors. It was like open and cold and, doing these sorts of exams are very vulnerable and exposing. And you're being penetrated and scraped in your innermost areas, and there's no consideration for like being in your body or like being relaxed. And it's just very like, do it. And there is a lot of trauma that can occur in the gynecologist office. And throughout this exam, I just remember being like, oh my God, like I can't do this anymore. Like this, I'm not healing. What's wrong with me? Something's wrong with me. And the doctor, when she was done, she came and like put her hand on my leg and like looked me in the eyes and said, well, you refuse our treatments. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. And so like I walked out of the hospital being like, I'm going to get cancer and I'm going to die. Okay. This is great. Like, these people who I bestowed all of my trust in have basically told me I'm a lost cause. And in that moment, or not in that moment, I went home and I took a shower, and I was just like sobbing in the shower because I was just so distraught because I felt like something was seriously wrong with me. And all of a sudden, like this like light came within my body. And in that moment, I decided I was going to figure it out myself. I was like, okay, if they're not going to help me and they're not going to give me any information, I'm going to freaking figure this out myself, and I'm going to heal. Mm-hmm. And so I took myself on a healing journey. And so for 3 years, I explored everything about the cervix, about cervical dysplasia, about women's health, about HPV. And, you know, while I was in graduate school, I really took time to look through research and look through, you know, the resources that were offered to me. That was one of my interests while I was in graduate school. And finally, you know, 7 years after my initial diagnosis, I get a call from my doctor on a Saturday, which is very strange because normally she would just send me a message via like the online messaging service via the hospital. Mm-hmm. And she called me. She said, Denell, I, you know, had just had a PAP like a few days before. And she's like, I had to call you because your PAP came back clear. Your HPV's, it's gone. It's not showing any signs in your body. And your cervix is healthier than I've ever seen it.
Wow. And so that was a striking result for her. Like, had she seen that before?
I don't believe so. No.
Yeah.
I mean, not with someone who had had it that long, and not with someone who had refused the treatments. I was like the bad girl. I was like the bad patient because I continuously said no to my doctors. And so, you know, in that moment of realizing I'd healed myself, there was jubilation and excitement. And then that quickly turned to anger. And I was like, what the F? Nobody told me any of this information that I had learned, because I took myself on like this deep educational dive into women's health and the cervix. I'm like, no one ever talked to me about the cervix. No one ever told me what cervical dysplasia actually was. No one ever told me the root causes or how I could support myself. And then I started thinking about like the millions of women who go through this every year. And so that's when I decided to put all this together and develop Cervical Wellness, which is about bringing awareness to this portion of the body that women are told they have to get checked every year, and to educate women about how they can either heal themselves, because it is possible, and I know it's possible because I did it, or how they can prevent abnormal PABs. And so, you know, I work one-on-one with women. I teach workshops. I do online, programs, and it's evolving into like a women's health, like empowerment, wave where women are realizing that even in modern times, we're told that we're, you know, as young girls, we're not supposed to masturbate. We're not supposed to touch ourselves because like sticking something inside of ourselves is dirty or nasty. That we're not supposed to even like look at ourselves in a mirror or even be aware of this portion of our body, that this portion of our body is, our lower half, our pelvic bowl is only to make babies and only like to bring pleasure to men in sex. And obviously I'm not saying that that's how all people think, but that's how we have been conditioned to believe, or what we've been conditioned to believe. And so my work now is transitioning into giving women permission to like bring their consciousness back down to their reproductive system. I call it the generative system because it's not just about reproducing humans. Like this is like the creative center of a woman's body. This is where new ideas and inspiration stem from. And the cervix is like this, I call it a sacred portal. It's like this portal between the inner world of a woman's body, the womb, and the outer world. So the vaginal canal is not considered an internal viscera. It's not inside of the woman's body. I mean, sure, it's like inside, you can't see inside there, but it's just basically like a collapsed tube. Mm-hmm. And so like there's no like the only barrier between the this outside world and the inner world is actually the cervix, which sits in between the vaginal canal and the womb. And, my work is also transitioning to talking to men about this because, when a man penetrates a woman, the head of his penis is literally coming into direct contact with the cervix. And if you look at what a cervix looks like, it looks like the head of a penis. Like if you just like push the cervix out and elongated the vagina, it would look like a penis. And I'm not saying that women have a penis inside them. I'm just saying that the anatomy is very similar. And so for men to know that the most exposed part of the cervix is also the most delicate, that there is this transformation zone there and the cells are very sensitive to damage. I feel like men who have sex with women need to know this, and that the cervix is actually so intelligent, is just an intelligent body part. And because I call it a she, although some people might not call it a she, I'm going to continue to call it a she, that the she is this epicenter of pleasure, that the ultimate orgasm a woman can have is a cervical orgasm. And in order for the cervix to be in proper position to orgasm, that's where foreplay comes into play. So I'll give you a moment to ask questions a moment after this.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So as you and I are sitting here, like when a woman is just sitting here casually having a conversation, like not sexually aroused, the cervix sits pretty low in the vaginal canal. So from the opening of the canal to where the cervix is, it's about like 2 to 4 inches, maybe 2 to 3 inches. So that's not like a lot of space.
Right.
Yet when a woman begins to get turned on and, arousal begins to happen, the cervix gets the idea like, oh, something might be coming in to the vaginal canal. I want to get out of the way so I don't get hit, so I don't get like slammed essentially. And I want to be in proper position so that I can like be this like epicenter of pleasure. So the cervix actually moves up and into the body and elongates the vaginal canal so that whenever the woman is then penetrated, the cervix doesn't get like slammed and hurt. Mm-hmm. And that the tip of the penis can just like essentially kiss the cervix, and stimulation will be more gentle, although it can be rough as well, but it's not as forceful, or it's not as like blunt. But if not enough time is given for arousal to begin, for the cervix to get that message, and then to travel, then it gets essentially beaten. Mm-hmm. And the amount of time that takes is anywhere from 20 to 45 minutes from like initial, neural messaging to processes of moving up. So, it's pretty scary how many women I've spoken to. I'd say like 95% of women that I've spoken to talk about how they've experienced extremely painful sex in their cervix because they weren't properly aroused, or they weren't aroused enough, and they just endured. Mm-hmm. And this is a very common story. And so my work is also moving to encouraging women to use their voice in sex and like tell your partner, hold on, I'm not ready. Like, that's okay. It's okay to say that. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm doing.
Awesome. Tell us more about cervical orgasms, because that's something that I'm sure most men don't know about, but do women know about that even?
No.
Okay.
No, it's really sad. And I mean, I don't want to make it seem like I'm like a professional cervical orgasmer. But so it is said that there are like 3 different types of orgasms a woman can have. Like there's a clitoral stimulation, which is most like a male orgasm. So like you have that build up, like release, and then like drop down. Mm-hmm. Then there's like the G-spot orgasm, which is like on the front inner area of the vaginal canal, and that's the place of stimulation where a woman is most likely to squirt. Mm-hmm. I don't like that word. Ejaculate. There we go. I just think of the soda squirt. Anyway. And then there's the cervical orgasm, and the cervical orgasm is said to be to bring women to a place of pleasure and opening that can last for hours or even days. And so I haven't spoken about this, but the cervix is a portal. Like it's an actual portal, and when women are connected to it, so like women have to, it's not just all on like whatever's penetrating her to bring her to cervical orgasm. Like she has to be in her body with her breath, her awareness down on the cervix, and actively releasing and opening herself. Mm-hmm. So many women approach sex in a very constricted way. Mm-hmm. And that is like the antithesis to cervical orgasm. So the way that a man can support a woman to cervically orgasm is to allow her to be in control. So generally, like woman on top is a recommended position, because she is able to control like depth and what's the word, like quickness or rapidity, rhythm. There we go. Or if she fully trusts him and is able to open herself up in a way, penetration from behind also is beneficial to this, but it has to be continuous, repetitive rhythm. So it can't be like stopping, because he can't control himself, and there can't be like a change in pace. That it's like has to be like a trance-like rhythm and motion, so that she can drop out of her head into her body and allow the opening to occur. And there isn't like this moment of peak and like and then dropping. It's like it's just like a continuous like rise up plateau, and from what I have read and just in my own personal life, there is like no end. Like there's no like moment when it happens. It's although it can happen when you kind of like go out of body, and it's like a psychedelic experience, or it's like full body, like visionary, like full conduit connected to the heavens and to the earth. It's like the female body is really powerful in this way, and this is where sex priestesses of ancient times would use this sort of energy to access information and intelligence. And it's really sad that most women don't even know it's possible. But again, there has to be a trust and a willingness to release the gripping, release the control, and trust their partner to be there for them in that state. Because a lot of women have a hard time being seen in writhing moments of pleasure, because maybe your face looks funny, or making funny sounds, or whatever. It's like you have to be willing to be fully seen, and he has to be fully willing to witness her in this as well.
And he's got to be really in tune with her body and where she is in order to like adjust his rhythm to kind of like help her build up to that place.
Right. And it's also on her to communicate. So it's incredible, like how often women do not speak up for themselves. And I don't know why. I mean, I guess I do know why. There's like a fear that he'll get upset or mad or frustrated. But if she wants to achieve the state, she has to be willing to use her voice.
So I'm sure it's different for different women, but what's kind of the like optimal pressure and rhythm? Is it kind of like I imagine that he wants to touch the cervix with some pressure, but obviously not too hard, but kind of like you press against it, and maybe like a steady rhythm, like you said, but probably a little bit on the like slower side.
Yes. So
to kind of
I can really always
allow
speak
her to like
for myself.
deepen into it.
Yeah. So it's what's coming up is like deep and slow.
Yeah.
So that's why like I've watched other videos of other teachers, and they talk about like remaining deep and then like grinding, or like not like pulling all the way out and going all the way in, but like remaining deep and kind of churning.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Churning. Churning the butter.
Yeah.
But again, it depends, like each
and she has to also like open to that pleasure, right?
Yes.
And really kind of like allow it to spread through her body, or
yes,
and not clench down around that intensity of sensation,
yes,
even if it's pleasurable.
Yes. And many women
happens.
are afraid. They get afraid of the pleasure. It's so true. And each woman's vaginal canal is different length. Each man's phallus is a different length. Like it's just gotta work with each other, and that's where communication comes in. But this is what I know to be true, and this is what I've learned. I mean, I've like Kim Anami. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's an amazing woman who talks about sex, and Layla Martin. These two women really go into like how to achieve these sort of states, and I am definitely not a professional practitioner. I just like to bring awareness to the fact that this is possible.
Yeah.
And in modern pornography and whatnot is just like so focused on the clitoris. And that's fantastic. The clitoris is like this amazing pleasure center, but there's more. There's so much more. So
does clitoral stimulation help in a cervical orgasm or not?
That's a good question.
Or are they completely separate? I don't know.
They are completely separate. Although what's coming to me is like warming her up to receiving pleasure by way of clitoral clitoral orgasms. So, women can, even if they orgasm, they can still continue. Right. So that's a good primer. It's a good primer. And the thing is as I've learned about, sexual literacy and sexual beingness is, like cervical orgasm doesn't have to happen every time. In fact, it probably won't happen every time because we have life stresses and life pressure, and you really have to be relaxed, and you have to like, when I have questions from men often like, well, how can I support this, with my partner? I say, well, do the dishes, like
my other friend said that too.
Yeah. Like make sure there's no pile of laundry on the ground, or like keep the space clean. Yeah. Make it welcome.
Create a relaxed environment and facilitate that. Yeah.
Exactly. If there's any energetic static between you two, like clear that, have that conversation, because she won't be able to get into that mindset at all. It's I don't know this for a fact because I don't live in a male body, But from what I have noticed in the men that I have been with and just in conversations I've had is that men are able to kind of like put like life in a little box and put it away and then like be in sex, and like that's fantastic. But women, like I just recently learned that actually our corpus callosum, which is the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, is actually thicker in female bodies than in male bodies. And so we access the two hemispheres more easily, and we live in the two hemispheres of our brain more readily. And so, you know, if there's like money problems, or if you're thinking about like needing to pay the mortgage or whatnot, that's going to come into the sexual experience, because we can't turn it off. We can't box that away and not think about it. It's like in our sphere.
Yeah.
Oh, I love talking about sex.
I do too. Who doesn't? It's magical.
My friend one time was like, Denell, you talk about sex, you talk about drugs, rock and roll's next.
Yeah, when's your band coming out?
Right. Like, oh, I'm not much of a musician. But.
So tell people where they can find you on social media, and you have a program coming up, is that right? What you were saying earlier, like an 8-week program or something?
Yes, although it'll probably be past and through by the time this comes out, but it's an 8-week program called The Sacred Portal, and it's 8 weeks to unveil and unlock the stories hidden within the cervix for healing and well-being. So one thing I teach is that everything that has ever penetrated a woman, good or bad, like positive experiences, adverse experiences, the cervix remembers. So, you know, our body is very intelligent, and even if our mind wants to forget experiences, our body will always remember. And for many women who have cervical dysplasia, I have found that there's a direct correlation to unprocessed adverse sexual experiences. And so this 8-week program is guiding women into the darkness that is within their reproductive system, to face it, to process it, to integrate it, and then to come out the other side untethered, like we talked about, and renewed, which will automatically bring back life force energy to this portion of their body that really needs it. So you can find me at my website, cervicalwellness.com. I'm also on Instagram at cervicalwellness or at Denell Nawrocki. I have 2 Instagrams. And
spell that for people too, just so they...
My name?
Yeah, your name.
DENELLNAWROCKI. Yeah, it's a doozy. And I am in the works of launching DenellNawrocki.com as well, which will be more about my work with psilocybin mushrooms and my work in forest therapy, which we didn't talk about. But
we'll talk about that next time.
Okay. Yeah. So I am a woman of many trades.
You are. Well, thank you so much for coming over today and being on the show.
Yeah.
It was a fascinating conversation, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of several topics. But so yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Finch. I had a great time.
Let me know what you guys thought of the episode. You can find me on Twitter at FinchCanFly, Instagram and Facebook at Chronicles of a Psychonaut, and check out the video stream as well on YouTube. You can find the link in the description. If you like today's episode, I think you'll like next week's episode as well. I talked to my friend Jasmine, who is a Dakini or sexual healer. And we talk about the field of sexual healing and also about relationships and intimacy and some of the blocks that can come up in us as individuals and how we bring them into our relationships. So join me next week.